All right, hi everyone. I'm Shrey. I'm a researcher at Microsoft focused on identity, privacy, and coordination. And today we have an incredible panel joining us, and I'd like to start by just introducing some of them. So I'll start with Henry on the left here. Henry Farrell is a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and editor-in-chief of the Monkey Cage blog at the Washington Post. He works on a variety of topics, including democracy, the politics of the internet, and international and comparative political economy. Julian Zawistowski is a decentralized systems visionary and entrepreneur, founder until June 2019, CEO of Golem Foundation, Golem Factory, economist by trade, fascinated with blockchain technology, as well as sociology and economics of decentralized systems. In the past, consultant and researcher of public policies, co-founded of Polish think tank and Economic Policy Institute for Structural Research. And I believe we have Puja as well, who's here virtually with us, who is a lawyer, strategist at Flashbots, and one of the leading thinkers in Web3, and co-authors of the seminal Decentralized Societies paper. So today, we're here at the Freedom Games and hosted by the Liberty Foundation. And many ideas of liberty are often associated with individualism or the sovereign individual, yet early thinkers like John Dewey, who we're going to talk a bit more about in a bit, have made these claims that humans are fundamentally social and their actions have consequences on one another, and these consequences enable us to have these networks of people that need to become what he calls publics. And so over the next hour, we're going to work together to see how what we call a network society can be a much richer form of how we can enable liberty in society. And so Henry, I wanted to start with you. We mentioned briefly a bit about John Dewey, but he may not be as popular in Poland as he is in the United States. And so I wanted to get more context from you on how you could describe Dewey, some of his thinking on the public, and how it's relevant to today.
So I'd be delighted to do that. So John Dewey, he wrote in the early to mid 20th century. He is a famous American pragmatist philosopher, and his ideas about politics were pretty straightforward. So he was a very strong Democrat, and he believed that democracy began with problems. That is, we see a problem in the world, we understand collectively that we have a problem, we begin to try and figure out what that problem is, and we try to solve it. And that means that a public forms around the problem. That is, a public is a group of individuals who organize themselves in some kind of a way to deal with whatever problem that is. And then that is the basis of democracy from Dewey's perspective. He says, this is when democracy begins. It's when you understand that you have these shared problems and when you organize publics around them. And that also can be often very difficult because it's extremely difficult sometimes to figure out, first of all, what the problem is. It may be invisible, and it also may be difficult to solve the problem once you've done that. But I think that there are a lot of resonances between how Dewey sees this and many of the problems that we face today. One of the big things that Dewey points out is that very often the kinds of institutions we have politically are not well suited to the scale of the problems that we have. So he was writing in the period of the First World War, for example, and he was looking at the ways in which the world economy, warfare was transforming the world, and all of these international problems were forming, which we did not have publics around because they were being obstructed by the nation-state system and the way that the nation-state system was organized. So roughly speaking, Dewey then argues, you want to have democracy at the scale of the problems that you need to solve. And if you find yourself stuck in a system where the institutions that you have do not match that scale of problems, then from Dewey's perspective, you are in a big democratic space which you need to figure out very quickly how to try to change those institutions.
Yeah, thank you. And for Puja, who's online with us, I wanted to ask you, a lot of the pervading views in the blockchain ecosystem today, which are presented as a potential solution to how we can work towards democratic solutions, focus on this idea of corporate libertarianism and reference the words, the sovereign individual. Can you talk a bit more about how these ideas combat with some of the thinking that Dewey is presenting around publics as well as individuals being fundamentally social?
Sure. Yeah, so there's this pervading ideology of sovereign individualism where the view is that individuals have to liberate themselves from, say, the shackles of social institutions, governments, and agencies that they're born into, and kind of redefine their own freedom in a kind of like race to the bottom. And it's pretty destructive, I think, and it's in stark contrast to the work of Dewey, to the work of decentralized society, where we recognize individuals as being embedded within communities, and communities being constituted by their individuals, forming larger and larger networks of cooperation. And the key is not, the emphasis of sovereign individualism is on exit, whereas, digital democracy and the work of Dewey, I think, is more of an emphasis on voice and building up networks of social cooperation, that where one set of social groups or elites don't come to dominate another, but rather we have bottom-up participatory mechanisms where the individuals that constitute the network determine its fate, govern it, and actively participate in it. So I would say that those are sort of the broad technological differences between the view of sovereign individualism versus digital democracy.
For anyone who wants to jump in here, I think one of the other points Dewey makes is that the role of a social scientist is to uncover some of these invisible forces that exist between the interdependencies between people. And for anyone who wanted to jump in, just talking a bit more about some of the invisible forces that you've been examining that aren't as well discussed today around the interdependencies of people that are causing some of the problems that we have.
Well, maybe I can jump in here quickly because I also just wanted to really reiterate what Puja said, which I think is absolutely key, is the difference between exit and voice here, which is that if you look at the sovereign individual, the idea is basically that you can get out of arrangements you don't like. If you look at Dewey, you find yourself in a world where you have to work together in a community to try to solve problems, rather than fleeing to New Zealand and letting the world take care of itself. And so I think that's a problem that we can see, for example, today in Europe and also in the United States, as we are back in something like the early 20th century again, and sort of a period of warfare, of turmoil, of economic problems where nobody actually understands what and has a very good sense of where we are going. So in my other hat, my non-democratic theory hat, I study what is sometimes called weaponized interdependence. This is a term that myself and a co-author have coined for describing the ways in which all of these networks that link the world economy together are being weaponized, are being used by actors in order to try and sort of coerce others. And here, for example, the way in which Russia is using Gazprom and Nord Stream 2 as a means of, and the original Nord Stream, as a means of trying to put pressure on Europe and the European economy, is a perfect example of that. So I think that part of what we need to do with these interdependencies is to try and figure out, first of all, how to bring them to the fore, and secondly, what is the appropriate level of politics to solve them at. And here I think, I think a lot about what is happening in the European Union. I think about the ways in which the European Union is really trying to push forward the energy transition, not just in a response to the need for a post-carbon world, but also in a response to the need for a world in which Europe is not sort of effectively fundamentally dependent upon the whims of tyrants. That's going to take a huge amount of organizing at the EU level between all of the different member states, which are squabbling and fighting with each other as they always do. The European Commission, it's going to take also a lot of action happening at the national and at the local levels. If you want to have an energy transition, trying to solve the problem of how it is that we for example, I come from Ireland originally, where there are a lot of fights about where you put the wind turbines, and I think those fights are being replicated throughout Europe. Everybody wants a green transition. Nobody necessarily wants ugly-looking wind turbines in their neighborhood, and we are going to have to figure out the appropriate scales of democracy to solve these problems if we're going to survive and live together better.
Julian,
Can I just jump in here, Shrey?
Yeah, go ahead, Puja.
So one thing I want to highlight here is actually how the energy infrastructure questions, Henry, that you're raising are key. But we also have digital infrastructure. We have physical and digital infrastructure. And the same questions that are arising in energy are also arising in our digital world. In particular, you can look at the recent events around Starlink and around Twitter, and particularly having one person being the decision maker there. And it's, and I would say that's sort of like a more corporate libertarian version of digital infrastructure versus, and the energy infrastructure question that you're raising, Henry, is, I would say, more a autocratic version. And what we want to do is have a kind of bottom-up digital democracy version of infrastructure where it's both digital and physical, which are interlinked, are governed and owned by the network users in a participatory way where consensus is generated relatively quickly. And so, so I just wanted to highlight that these energy infrastructure questions are, I think, just a small set of a larger set of problems.
Yeah, thank you. And Julian, I wanted to see if you had anything to add before we transition, but yeah.
Well, maybe just, from European perspective that was already briefly discussed, I think that the problem here in Europe is not only that our institutions are failing on many occasions, are not up to the problems we have at the moment, but also the fact that we don't really have institutions for that exact crisis and for that exact moment in a history, whether this is energy crisis in EU or responding to the war, or even having more legitimacy, more democratic legitimacy to European level of the Union. And the truth is, that was also discussed during yesterday's opening panel, and I totally agree with that. That there is like a very short window at the moment, perhaps only 2 years, for Europe to put its things together and get ready for like a real play. Because if there is, for example, shift of power in US in 2 years, and all of a sudden US stops supporting Europe against Russia, then Europe has to do on its own. And it will not be up to the task with the institutions it has at the moment, most likely, or it will be very, very challenging. So this is not like a purely theoretical discussion. This is perhaps a discussion about the survival of the free world, how we build that institutions.
I think that's right. And I think if you look at the European debate over the last number of years, there's been a focus on what is called, and of course, Brussels always comes up with these technical sounding terms, strategic autonomy. And the idea behind strategic autonomy originally was this was Macron and the French wanting to try and figure out ways that they could detach Europe from the United States even before Trump became elected. But increasingly this has become, I think, the focus of debate in Europe, which is what exactly does strategic autonomy involve, and what kinds of ways does Europe need to change its activities in order to be better capable of protecting itself and of assuring its own interests. Now, there are many different ways in which this could go. This could go in, I think, some extremely positive ways. It could also go in some extremely bad ways, because Europe, of course, has a legacy of colonialism. It has a legacy of behaving sometimes in some extremely self-centered ways towards the rest of the world. Obviously, self-centered behavior is not exactly unusual in the world of global geopolitics, but equally there are ways in which you can do this that are towards the common benefit and not towards the common benefit. And so I think one of the major challenges that Julian, I think, identifies correctly here is thinking through what would strategic autonomy look like in a world where Europe cannot depend on the United States anymore, cannot at the same time equally, and this is Joseph Farrell made a very interesting speech about this last week, also cannot depend on Russia, obviously, for energy, or China for economic growth. How does Europe try to reforge itself in a way that is both independent and autonomous, and getting to, I think, some of Puja's important questions, also has some important role for democracy, because this is something that Europe has traditionally been absolutely terrible at, which is involving genuine genuine democratic decision-making and debate at the transnational level. So there are a huge, huge number of difficult questions that Europe has to confront right now.
And earlier, Henry, you mentioned all these different layers of coordination that needs to happen in the EU for decision making to take place. That type of intermediaries to make decision is common not just among the EU, but in a lot of governance decision making processes. Are there some frameworks or ideas that you think we can lean on, either from Dewey or other frameworks that you've seen quite useful that could be a tactical approach to maybe how we can think about governing some of these systems?
So it's really complicated because the problem here is that a lot of these decisions involve national security, which of course, and sort of almost by definition of the word, is something that the EU has not been particularly developed at. If you look, for example, at decisions about sanctions, they still have to be made by unanimity among all the member states, which means that when you get a state such as Hungary, which is friendly towards Russia, it's possible for them to block and to impede and to hold back. So on the one hand, I think you do need to move towards something which is more like a majority form of decision making, so that it's possible to actually take decisions quickly where they do need to be taken, getting to Julian's point about how we have 2 years. On the other hand, and this gets to Puja's point, you cannot have that without a greater degree of legitimacy at the EU level. And trying to figure out ways in which you can involve citizens better into the debates over these questions, that's something that I think the EU has yet to even begin to think about how that might possibly work.
If I may just
go ahead.
one quick comment, because in our correspondence with Glenn at some point, he reminded me about the fact that about 20 years ago, when Poland was about to join EU, there was like a huge discussion around governance within the EU, and one of the proposals discussed then and dismissed was for the countries to vote with a square root of the population, which somehow fits into some ideas of RadicalxChange. Couldn't resist making that comment.
Totally. And Puja, I know you've also thought a bit more about how to build legitimacy of institutions at a larger level, but talking a bit more about bottom-up legitimacy and how we can think about some of the frameworks that you've been thinking about there. If you could comment a bit more, it would be great.
Yeah, so I actually want to push back a little on Henry's point on getting majority decisions made. I actually think what we're referring to as quadratic voting is a much a consensus mechanism. And what quadratic voting does is it allows people to express the intensity of their preferences, not just the direction. So if you're voting amongst a set of policies, you can reflect your intensity on one set of policies or another, and the square root modulates the tyranny of the majority that might arise. And in particular, I think the key principle for building decentralized networks, or networks that are bottom-up participatory or pluralistic networks, which I think is just an analogy for a synonym for decentralization. The key principle there is actually consensus across difference. And the idea there is that if you have a bunch of countries, for example, or citizens from different countries in the EU that are trying to come to an agreement on what is the next step for this digital infrastructure or energy infrastructure, or this shared good, what you want to do is actually find consensus amongst the most diversely affiliated individuals who come from very different social groups. And a consensus among the most different people is a better signal of a shared good or a good policy that is broadly beneficial to the network, rather than a policy that is consented amongst more similarly affiliated people, whether they be similarly affiliated through race, economics, geography, or so on. There are many dimensions in which we're individuated as individuals. If you get the consensus amongst the most different people rather than consensus of most similar people, right, you get a better gauge of like what is a good policy for this broader network versus something that's going to inure benefits to a special interest or a set of actors. So the work that I'm doing is actually trying to build bottom-up technological systems that reflect this principle of consensus across difference, which I think is actually key to a pluralistic future.
Henry, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
So I'm trying to think about, and here, as I say, Dewey was a pragmatist, which means he was not necessarily always a very practical pragmatist, but he was somebody who tried to think about not just in sort of what to do, but how to get there, given what we have at the moment. So I think that there are two different challenges that face Europe at the moment. One is a challenge of state incapacity, that there are simply things that Europe is very, very badly suited to be able to do, and some of this touches on national security. And here I probably, I probably am in favor of, at least in the short term, trying to move towards a slightly less veto-driven system, because I think that the decisions that have to be made rapidly over the next couple of years are probably not going to we're not going to be able to get to a system of better democratic decision making before some of the key questions that Julian was focusing on have to be addressed. But, and here the important but is, I think that where Puja's suggestion really resonates for me is thinking about some of the stuff that's been happening in my native Ireland. So Ireland, as some of you may be familiar with, is a country that was very much it was a poor, Catholic country with a very, very little sense of divergence or difference or accommodation or willingness to deal with that until the late 1980s. I lived through the transition, which is a different transition than the people in Poland lived through, but nonetheless was a pretty big one from our perspective. And now Ireland has, in recent years, it has introduced marriage equality by a thumping majority into its constitution through a popular vote. It's introduced various other measures which are reflective of a broader variety of views and perspectives. And here, one of the ways that this has happened is through these constitutional conventions, which involve randomly chosen citizens coming together over a period of a number of months and coming up with suggestions which then make it far easier for politicians to bring through difficult questions, because they have a sense that this is coming from the citizens rather than coming from them. It becomes less partisan, less divisive in a sense. So I wonder to what extent could Puja's work here be transformed with this, or be combined with this kind of model to create a more transformative model for Europe as a whole, and help perhaps, because I think there are two different things. There is the short-term things that need to be done, and there are big long-term constitutional changes that will have to happen within the EU in order to make this work in the longer term. And here I wonder whether Puja's thoughts might provide a good way for thinking better about citizen involvement.
So can I jump in here, Shrey?
Yep.
So a lot of these ideas that I'm talking about are actually inspired from the work in Taiwan that Audrey Tong has been doing in building digital democracy and building more bottom-up participatory systems where there's feedback between government and their citizens. And it's you, Henry, you keep underscoring national security, which I agree is the thorniest problem. And it's really interesting to have Taiwan as a model here, because they are under threat, right, from China in a very aggressive way. So these, I think, actually, these bottom-up participatory systems are key to building a more pro-social technological era that is almost protected, I don't want to say immune, but much more robust against attacks by foreign adversaries, and is a strength to national security, not a detriment to it.
Thank you, Puja. And Puja, I think you mentioned earlier some of the technological solutions to achieve consensus across difference, and so I wanted to propose a framework for how I think about why it's so hard to do it, and then Julian, Henry, and Puja can chime in and see where maybe I'm wrong and put forth their ideas. And so previously we had these very strong ideas of what it meant to communicate with one another, whether it was in the tribal dynamics of society or through religion, and we had very clear ideas of who was inside of a group and who was outside of a group. And over time, these tribes or regimes were quite oppressive to specific individuals. And so we found ways to release some of these groups and make them more sovereign and liberate them in many ways. But in some capacity, these individuals have become alienated, lonely, isolated. And one of the ways, a technical solution that we've tried to rebuild these bonds back up through is through social platforms. But social platforms lack the ability to provide context to each other. And there's this idea of what's called context collapse when we communicate with one another. And so it's even hard to identify who are the groups of people that you're trying to cooperate with. And so if we're trying to coordinate across differences or have consensus across difference, even recognizing the difference is quite hard. And so I'm curious to know some of the frameworks that you see in the challenges we have to identifying difference and how, the ways that we can start approaching technological solutions to achieve that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think you opened a Pandora box here, because first we have to agree with your diagnosis and then propose the solution to whatever problem it is. I will try to be brief. So I don't necessarily think that what you just said is the reason for the fail of our institution at the moment, because we started with the notion that our institutions are failing, they are not up to the problems, and that's the problem I would like to focus on. And the context collapse, I think they are more to the phenomena that Neil Postman described in Amusing Ourselves to Death. So that the way we communicate at the moment supports exactly the context collapse, because this is about amusing ourselves and not about having like a meaningful communication most of the times. Not for everyone, not always, but every too often. So I think that and I think that we can see that even with the experimentation we have in the decentralized space, in governance, in many situations. Because if you ask any DAO practitioner, for example, like what's the biggest problem with the DAO, then one of the, I think, top 2 problems.
Can you just say what a DAO is?
Yes, decentralized autonomous organization. So not digging into details, because that has, I think, about 20 different definitions of what it is. But basically it is a concept of bringing people together to collectively have some kind of governance over something that is as much decentralized and as much algorithmically encoded on blockchain, for example, as possible. That's one of the possible definitions. I think the other one that probably will work as well is just like a gathering people around some kind of idea and trying to put them into collective decision making. Yet another would be like just having tokens and voting with tokens and making money out of it. One of the 2 biggest problems is that those are often tokens that can be traded, so this turns into speculative game, not really a governance. But the second is low participation. It's low participation, so exactly the same problem that democracies have at the moment, that people are either not voting or they are not voting in an informed way. And I think that the solution that we can look for in our space, the centralized space, and probably that could be then transformed later to like a wider, to broader world, is to try to, I hated this word, but it expressed that best, like try to gamify that a little bit. So to make that attractive for people to actually participate in that governance, to actually get them hooked, them involved in that decisions that way or another. In our world, in like the blockchain space, let's call it like that, but also in the RadicalxChange world, I think this is called like a mechanism design. So you design the process in that case, like the decision-taking process, in a way that will like loop people in, that they will care to participate. And I think that can be done in many different ways. Like the most obvious one that works in many democracies is that there is a fine if you do not vote. And and then obviously like you just put a price on being passive. Like whatever how you vote, you can like vote like a invalid vote, but you have to vote. So this is like I think the simplest like a mechanism design that is imposed like globally in a given society that to increase that participation rate. But we can think about so many other things. I think even like the idea of exactly quadratic voting. So basically giving people like more than one vote and allowing them to like cast more than one vote in a given voting, and perhaps also like a negative vote with the square root of that vote. It makes things more complicated, obviously. But come on, this is like a third grade mathematics. Like people can really deal with that. And if we are only able to explain to them how much fun it is to not only vote for someone, but also against someone you really don't like. And according to all simulations, we can see that that would change the results of the votes dramatically. So obviously this is not the direct answer to the institutional problems of EU at the moment, but definitely there are tons of things we can learn from the decentralized space, and this is depending on exactly like what is your diagnosis of the problem we are facing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think before we get to the institutional question, I think is much bigger and harder to tackle, and what are the problems? There's so many. I think the question I'm curious now, Henry or Puja, to chime in on is like specifically, like, why is it hard for us to get consensus across difference, and what are some of the problems that you see in that problem?
Okay, well, I come at this, and so it's good to have an argument on a panel. So I come at it from a very different perspective than Julian here. And so here I think that where I want to start here is again with the problems. And I think that if you want to get people involved in this, I think that the best way to think about it is not in terms of gamifying, not in terms of mechanism design, but in terms of the real and fundamental problems that people face and giving them means to solve them. And if you want to take a really perverse sort of silver lining view of the world at the moment, we have a hell of a lot of fucking problems. There are a lot of ways in which you could, there are a lot of things that you need urgently to address. So I think that rather than starting with the mechanism, I think start with the problem and try to offer people a practical, concrete way to say, okay, here's a problem that is going on in your community. Here are the ways that you deal with it. Second, I think that rather than looking to, I think that there is this wonderful world of sort of blockchain and mechanism design, but I also think that it's very, very easy to get pulled into the mathematics because the mathematics seem to be fun and exciting in their own right. And I think that the person who I see as being the person who is best to go to for understanding this is not a mechanism design person, but somebody who was ignored by the economics field for decades before she finally won a Nobel Prize, and that's Lynn Ostrom. She has this wonderful book, Governing the Commons, which looks across hundreds and thousands of different societies to see what kinds of institutions they have used to solve collective problems. And I think that kind of science of problem solving is a better way to go. And final thing I would say here is that I think that the book that I think is, for me, the most attractive way about thinking about these things relatively recently is by a science fiction writer, Ruthanna Emrys. This book is called A Half-Built Garden. I think that this book should become, for this generation, what I think, so say, for example, Neil Stephenson's Cryptonomicon was for a whole bunch of people in the exit world back in the 1990s, early 2000s. Peter Thiel talks about how this is the book that made him found PayPal. I think that it gives a very different understanding, and again, a problem-based understanding of how it is that you can begin to try and create these mechanisms which better try to solve these human problems of great difference and disagreement, which I think you rightly raised at the beginning. And more or less, her thought experiment here, it's a post-partial climate collapse world in which politics, the politics of exit is still there. The billionaires have all fled to New Zealand, and they've created this weird artificial society around themselves. The remnants of the federal government are still around, but people have begun to reconstitute themselves around watersheds because watersheds are where many of the key problems are. And the ways in which they deal with this, Ruthanna is somebody who begins not from mechanism design or zero knowledge proofs or whatever. She begins from cognitive science. And so her fundamental question is, how could you design systems for decision making and for problem solving that rather than trying to harness our cognitive biases, as many of the systems do right now in order order to create these feedback loops that keep us clicking, clicking, clicking. Instead, tried to solve and mitigate these cognitive biases and flaws so that we were better able to figure out what we actually understood, what we actually disagreed about, and what we actually agreed about. And I think it is a wonderful, extraordinary book, which I would really recommend to everybody in the audience to read. This is, for me, I think, if you want to understand where to go, I think Len's work is fantastic with Puja. Danielle Allen also has a fantastic book coming out next year, which is more pure political theory. But in terms of practically thinking about how to bring this world of mechanism design together with real problems, I think Rosanna Emrys's book is the best thing I've seen. A Half-Built Garden.
Puja, I want to give you some room to add on here.
Yeah, so that's a lot. I will try to bridge both of these perspectives a little. So, Henry, I agree with you. The work of Elinor Ostrom is key. And, but at the same time, I think Web3 can give us a nice experimental space to express consensus over how to govern commons using consensus across difference in a way, and in a way we haven't been able to do before. So I see Web3 and mechanism design as being complementary to the larger canon of work here, and opening up some possibility spaces that haven't existed before. Even quadratic vote funding, these are relatively nuanced ideas, but at the same time very intuitive, but it takes, as you said, people some time to understand. And those experiments have happened with Gitcoin and Web3 first, and there's been a lot of learning on how to articulate principles, how to communicate, and also to your point about voting, where voting should happen, right? There are different problems, different social coordination problems at different layers. There's global climate change. There are also local problems. There's commons problems, right? Trees, for example, and forced functioning voting on every level of the stack is not necessarily feasible or practical. You also want deliberation. You want delegation. But I think the key again here is to try to express this principle of consensus across difference at every layer of social coordination. So what we get is a more networked society rather than a society that serves plutocrats or autocrats or some set of special interests that can hijack these very powerful networks and our communication channels as well. So I think that these views are more complementary and these tools are more complementary and assistive. But I definitely agree with you that Elinor Ostrom is probably one of the more seminal thinkers in underpinning all of this work.
Puja, one more question I had for you is it's often referenced that the Web3 community is very useful for it being almost like a sandbox to play around with these ideas. But are we seeing any of the translation from the Web3 community into some of these more traditional systems? And what has been a good process of taking some of these ideas in the Web3 community into more traditional systems so that people can be hopeful that those experiments are not just in this playful world of coins and this other territory?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say Web3 started off in this kind of corporate libertarianism where it was like individual versus nation state and like exiting the nation state. And I think Web3 now has to transition to digital democracy where it's actually a tool that empowers individuals nested within communities to form larger and larger cooperations, right? So it actually becomes a tool for voice rather than just exit. And the work that I have done has been on introducing a new primitive called soulbound tokens or non-transferable NFTs that as a very first and simple step lets people represent their memberships to social groups. And that's missing in Web3 right now, right? There's no civil resistance, there's no view on like how socially interdependent. And it's a very powerful idea to just have a simple primitive that represents your membership to a social group because, once you do that, you can start to do things with that social group. You can start to govern your communication channels as a social group and like the shared data that you produce in a socially programmable way. And this starts to get us away from, our Web 2, monolithic models of communication and social media where we are, as Henry pointed out, essentially brain fracked for information in a one-way street, rather than collectively deciding like what our algorithms are and having transparency on what it's doing to us and what we're doing to it, rather than just being attention fracked for our economy to maximize ad revenue. So I think Web3 is going to introduce some very simple primitives that will allow us to restructure our networks and how we govern them, starting with our communication channels and social media, and I'm very excited about that.
Julian, I was wondering if you wanted to add on to anything about the role that distributed systems or blockchains play in a lot of the problems that we've been talking about.
In fact, I only wanted to say that even if Henry does not exactly agree with me, I think I agree with him in a way that obviously we need to organize around problems, and that's what we are going to do. The question is if the institutions organized at the moment are sufficient, and if we do not have to improve that, perhaps also with the tricks that I have mentioned, or not. Maybe not, maybe yes, maybe not, but this is not mutually exclusive. And I would prefer us to get people organized around that problems before they need to organize around watersheds.
Okay, well, we can, I think there's a useful tension here. What I would say is that I think that Puja's idea, which really seems to me to be soulbound tokens are Lego bricks for community building, I think is a very, very attractive way to think about the world. I also think that there are some elements or some aspects of blockchain which actually could be problematic in terms of building in some exit. And here, and I know that this is something that is probably going to be very controversial with a lot of people in the blockchain community, I think moves like the Tornado Cash move of effectively sort of loading up your system to Ethereum and then throwing away the key and saying this cannot be changed. I think that those kinds of possibilities are something which are potentially, so you can see how they could enhance freedom in certain ways, but I think that they're potentially deeply problematic for democratic decision making, because they're effectively saying, I as an individual or as a group of individuals around a DAO can decide that this is the way that we can do things, we can program this into Ethereum and it will keep going. And I've used the analogy of a golem, so this is like we can keep it going, this will keep going like a deathless golem for as long as the Ethereum blockchain exists, and there's nothing you can do about it. Screw you if you disagree. So I think that there are some interesting and important tensions here, which I would love to see people talk about more directly.
Well, first I think that while Web3 or blockchains are a very useful sandbox for what you're talking about, I don't think they are necessarily part of the solution. So I can perfectly imagine a much better democracy without any blockchain-based solutions. That's absolutely for sure. As for Tornado Cash or other controversial things that happens on blockchain, I will run forward with my answer to what you said. So obviously, this immutability of blockchain, this freedom is a powerful part of the narrative, like the even funding narrative, especially for Bitcoin. But then, at the end of the day, this is also just a group of people, and just a group of interests, and just a group of people around some kind of ideology as well, which, in case of Ethereum at least, has proven in the past that can adapt to changing situation in a pretty flexible and pretty reasonable way. And I will maybe bring something that almost no one remembers now in that decentralized space, because you have to be in it more than 3 or 4 years. But there was this famous the DAO hack, which is not really a hack, but it happened in early days of Ethereum. For those who do not know the story, in 2016, that the code of the first decentralized autonomous organization was exploited in a way that someone has stolen 1/3 of ethers in that organization. At that time, that was a significant chunk of all the ethers in circulation. So that was a death blow to the Ethereum, in fact. And Ethereum, the community of Ethereum, because there is no one else than developers and miners and users taking that decision, decided to fork, to undo that hack, which was pretty controversial because like the promise of the original Bitcoin, for example, is that everything that happens on blockchain is final. You know, you throw those keys and they cannot be recovered, and it turned out that it can be recovered if only there is like enough of popular support for the decision to recover. So I would say that at the end of the day, this is also a community of people which, at least in case of Ethereum community, more often than not is pretty reasonable. Although I see that there are problems there, and the biggest probably is the one that was raised during the previous panel, that this is basically like plutocratic system. And probably that's the biggest issue I have personally with Ethereum, and many people have, apart from all the great things that are there. But I got sidetracked, I think. So.
Okay, yeah. Henry, I was curious to know, so you mentioned one problem that you had with distributed systems. Is there any other worries that you have in some of the experiments that are going on that go against some of the ideas and challenges that we were talking about earlier?
Well, you know, so if I think that this is something that I don't want, we should get back to Puja, because I don't want this to become a argument of sort of, guy versus guy. I think this can very often develop. I do think that there is the sense that this is a sandbox to try out different democratic governance regimes. This is something which is incredibly attractive and I think useful and helps to solve problems. So I do wonder, if the immutability is a big problem, so that the way in which you sort of solve the first doubts, as if you have to basically rewrite the history books and change the constitution in order to solve for a bank robbery. And that's something which my sense is probably not going to happen in a hurry again, that it was a sufficiently bitter fight at the time that they got it through, but with a great degree of unhappiness. And then the second question is, and I think you raised it pretty directly, is that there are a variety of different communities with different norms, and trying to get this through the Bitcoin community, something similar, would be a very, very different proposition. And of course, we have seen many different DAOs and sort of many different things go crazy or wrong or problematic, and all of these problems of centralization that you are raising. So I think it's really interesting, but here is what I would say, so if you want to look at it as a social scientist does, you want to look at what are the failure modes that we are discovering, as well as the benefits, and try to build forward from that. So maybe that's a more positive way of building, towards, if not agreement, sort of across some sort of radical differences, as Puja says, at least towards some kind of a rough consensus as to how you could begin to go forward.
Thank you, yeah, and Puja, get you back on the screen and sort of add on to anything that Henry just said.
Sure. I think we're still, just responding, I think we're still, as I said, in the early stages of Web3. And for example, on Ethereum, on the criticism there is a great paper that was just released about reversible transactions and exploring that possibility space. And this might address some of the questions around sanctions, for example, Henry. There's as I said before as well, the early stages of Bitcoin and Ethereum are in this individual versus nation state paradigm. When you start introducing an intermediate layer of communities, then decision-making and even what blockchains can do and how they help coordinate or facilitate cooperation starts to change. So I still think we're very early in what these technological substrates can do. I also don't think blockchains are a solution to everything. I think they're very useful for expressing common knowledge at a particular social layer, whether it be local or global. And I think it will, be a very useful tool to help even, negotiate the sharing of that knowledge between different social layers. But I certainly don't think it's the end all be all. And there's a lot of other interoperable systems and data structures, which Shrey, you have been exploring a lot, which will complement and augment the utility of blockchains, but alone, I don't think blockchains are going to like solve like all the problems. So I just wanted to temper that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, before we close, I want to make sure we give the audience some time to get some questions in. So we're going to start opening it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask any of our panelists? Say it, and then I can repeat it for the recording.
It's maybe more of an observation. So it was interesting to hear earlier about the DAOs in Ukraine. We sort of need the DAO in Poland. We don't have a war, but we have a very impressive humanitarian relief action done in a bottom-up way by citizens in Poland. And I like, Julian, what you said. I think that was an action that lacked an institution that could coordinate it. But when I listen to your ideas, which I'm sympathetic of, they sound very mechanistic. So I'm just curious, if we have this situation, probably hundreds of thousands of people coordinating in a very inefficient way to help basically refugees, and you have your blockchain-based primitives, how do you efficiently combine the two while the time is running out to do that? What's the first step? How do you get people?
Just to briefly re-ask the question, it's you have a short amount of time and you have a lot of people trying to coordinate quickly. How do these tools become a way to help solve that problem?
So I think Ukraine DAO is a great example of how that got organized bottom up. But on the other hand, like a Ukrainian DAO is more of a social phenomena than like a technical phenomena. So this like on a technical level, there is, and I'm not saying that to discredit that. This is absolutely okay, I think. But there is like, this is not a very sophisticated, like technically thing. This is like just like a committed group of people running things, doing fundraising, and doing some advocacy for certain things. And this is great, what they do. But this is more about like those people got organized. And this is more about ideas they got organized around, and like I would say, a vibe of how things should be run in a bottom-up, decentralized way, rather than like primitives of the blockchain technology that they used, because they used like a very rudimentary things, to my knowledge. Basically, they are funded through crypto donations, and they use like a multi-sig for governing the funds. So this is not like this one person taking the decision. So this is like a really like a rudimentary governance structure there. And I think this is obviously all right. So sometimes it is better not to over-engineer things, but just to get people around the idea and around that spirit. And I think in case of Ukraine DAO, this DAO is more about what they use to get to the correct people, like with the ability to fund things, than the actual technology that they use. So I would say that the Poland DAO or DAO would rather be a way of some activists to get to the certain groups of people to get funding, rather than applying any specific primitives at the moment. Which does not mean that there are no primitives that are ready to take from the shelves. There are some, but they are designed for like a totally different situations and problems. So there are like a working decentralized organizations with the active governance of the projects, but at the moment they are built around like a different problems, like a totally different problems.
Yeah, just to add on a bit as well, I think some of the research our team has been doing at Microsoft has focused on why blockchains are able to provide this property of what's called common knowledge in a much more efficient way than other communication protocols. And so, as an example, with certain distributed systems, I can get a high guarantee that if I send a message to Julian, I know that Julian knows that I know something, but I also know that Julian knows that I know that he knows, and there's these very rich forms of knowledge that get expressed. And so in some experiments we've done with supply chain, we've seen very increased amount of savings on supply chain just by using a blockchain to communicate instead of email or Excel spreadsheets, because we have this form of common knowledge. And we anticipate this to spread quite nicely to other social movements, like getting people to coordinate in a very time-efficient way when the stakes are quite high. As an example, sexual reporting internally or whistleblowing. Having tools that can do this in a privacy-preserving, but in a way that enables common knowledge, can be quite useful. Any other questions that we have from the audience? We have one there.
So I understand that the views on the DAOs were quite critical here in the panel, so maybe there's no point of looking for further weaknesses, but nevertheless I will ask, what about the climate impact? Because, for example, the cryptocurrencies computing is extremely energy consuming, creates warmth. So if we had to extend it to further other ways of governance, what about that?
I'm not critical towards DAOs.
If Puja had anything to add online, I mean, I can just briefly tee it up, is that there's a lot of work being done in what's called regenerative economics in the crypto community, focusing on using DAOs to fund carbon credits and other work in the climate space, but I'm not as well versed as maybe other panelists are.
So maybe I will just say that this is obvious that proof of work blockchains are very energy, they use a lot of energy for the proof of work. Personally, I'm mostly involved with the Ethereum community and RadicalxChange as well, as far as I know. And we are lucky with answering to that question to tell you that Ethereum actually transitioned to proof of stake last month, which means that the power consumption was cut by like 99% or even 99.9%. So basically there are no more miners using this like a huge racks with a lot of GPUs and consuming like insane amounts of energy. That's history for Ethereum. This is not a history for majority of other blockchains. So that's not a problem anymore, luckily. I think that was what your question was about. Yeah.
Are there any
I'll jump in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm not so pessimistic about DAOs. As I said, I think they are a useful sandbox for experimentation. And back to Henry's point, we have a lot of problems that we need to solve, and we need to rethink how democracy works and make it work better. And I think DAOs are actually our very first starting point that has attempted to have distributed, decentralized decision-making and being the intersection of both technology and democratic processes. And so I really think we need more experimentation on this intersection of technology and democracy in order to move forward. And DAOs are a very good place and a kind of like low, I would even say like low risk space to like even do that. And in order for I think the key takeaway for me here is in order for our democracy, in order to evolve a future that is democratic rather than autocratic or having these single points of failure, we need to embrace technology, right? We can't just like ignore it, and that would be to our detriment precisely because other actors, autocratic actors, or even like, corporate monopolies are using technology to their advantage. So in order to keep power distributed and bottom up, we need to find a way to use these tools, and I think DAOs are a very good first place.
Thank you, Puja. We'll take one last question from Matt here.
Thank you. Do you think it would be imaginable to implement this idea of decentralized decision-making in the healthcare system, especially if we have one centralized insurer and millions of patients, and empowering them to spend their money better?
I worked a bit on this at the Health AI team before, and like where, in terms of delivering patient care like surgeries or very direct access to care, maybe not, but when it comes to higher level, I need to provide my patient data, and I can take ownership of my data, and I can choose to provide my data to who I want to provide that data to, and get access to virtual care in a decentralized way, not just through one platform, through many. We're seeing a lot of explorations with how healthcare data can play a role in this decentralized way. People in Canada in particular can actually make money by lending their healthcare data to startups in a way that is currently locked up and siloed, and it's these decentralized primitives that are allowing people to start lending this data to startups that are also doing more research and publishing that research for the public healthcare community. So it's mutually beneficial, both for the patient, by they're able to monetize their data and do so in a privacy-preserving way, but also promote research by unlocking that data to more researchers. But that's very different than like decentralizing surgeries and all these other tactical forms, but there's this whole branch of what's called decentralized science that's being worked on, in particular the Ethereum community that's pushing a lot on this frontier.
And how much money will be spent for this and another procedure?
Oh, I'm not too well versed on that, but yeah, maybe we can find time after. I think we're all at time for now, but if there's any other questions, feel free to ask after. And thank you so much, Julian, Henry, and Puja online for this panel.
Thank you.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it. And how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Ihre Ausreise
Atlas Network is, as the name suggests, a network, and it's global. We work all around the world. We're based in the U.S. We have about 159 partners in the United States right now, and the bulk of our partners are outside, nearly 500 in total.
Atlas Network, it connects people from all over the world defending the idea of human dignity, defending human rights and personal liberties.
Atlas Network is focusing on, I think, the most important and moral cause in the entire world.
We partner with local innovators, local leaders who understand conditions on the ground in communities facing real challenges. We look at the people from the worldwide freedom movement that are passionate, are ready to make a difference, understand local conditions, and we invest in them.
At Atlas Network, we unleash individual ingenuity to enrich humanity.
The United States does not have a lock on the idea of freedom and liberty. Those ideas are beyond borders.
One of the main goals of Atlas Network is to eradicate poverty around the world, and we do that by investing millions of dollars in our partners' work every year.
Historically, wealthy nations around the world have tried to help low-income countries develop. The way we've been doing it traditionally has not really been working. So there's a movement to do development differently, and that means we need to step back as outsiders and rethink the role that we're playing in helping people in low-income countries achieve their dreams.
We want to make the world a better place. We want to make the world a freer world.
All of us want to leave a legacy and be part of something big to make a better world. This is exactly the work of Atlas Network.
With our growing number of hundreds of successful partners, we're stronger than ever.
Changing the world.
Changing the world.
Changing the world
starts together with us.